I got to spend 24 hours with the Panasonic GH5 and I loved it. Now let me just say that I have been using the GH4 for 2 solid years and it's been a workhorse of a camera for me. I use it on almost every single project. It's not usually my main, but it is a solid backup, and when it is my main because of budget or whatever, I really love it. The only thing I will say that was hurting in the GH4 was its low light capabilities. Everything else I was really comfortable with. Panasonic released the GH5 earlier this year and it's already building on all the best success points of the GH4 as well as fixing problems and issues that the GH4 had. Some of those things I'll just breeze over real quick before we even get into the footage. Having 2 memory cards is absolutely huge and amazing. You can do relay recording, you can double slot record, you can even kind of partition your files if you need to. Having a stabilized sensor inside the camera is totally a game changer. This like blew my mind. I've also noticed the LCD screen on the GH5 is a lot brighter and crisper than the GH4. I could see it a lot better in the direct sunlight. Just looking through it, it seems like it just has been upgraded in some way, shape, or form. The GH5 has a bigger body. It's a lot more solid than the GH4. It's got this kind of a metally feel to it when you hold it in your hands, and I really liked that. I think it's definitely a beefier body. Some of the other physical upgrades on it, the little scroll wheels that you use to change your aperture and shutter speed when you're in manual mode, those have gotten an upgrade. They're a lot more gritty. They're easier to turn. I love that kind of stuff. They're very tactile. I like tactile things in my cameras. We're gonna start off by looking at a little comparison between the GH4 and the GH5 in shooting in log in 4K. As you can tell, the rain has not let up, so we're trying to match settings on both the GH5 and the GH4 here. We can do some one-to-one, apples-to-apples comparison. Here's our Goose, still out there. Hey, Goose. He has agreed to be our test subject to start this thing off. So the GH5 starts here with this Goose, and then we can grade that. I'll say the vlog is really, really intense for both the GH4 and the GH5. I ended up buying the firmware update for vlog in the GH4, and it is just like way flat and way desaturated. And I feel like when I put LUTs on it, it needs more than that. It really needs to be pushed. So this right here is the log footage on the GH5, and the LUT that's overlaying has been contrast adjusted, and the blacks have been pushed and saturation's been added, as well as adding the LUT. So one of the big things about the GH5 this year that's just so interesting is they have added 10-bit 422 color recording, which is kind of unheard of to have internally in a camera of that size. So you're just getting a lot more uncompressed color. And I will say, side note, if you're a Premiere Pro user, Premiere Pro does not like the new GH5 footage. It crashed every single time I brought it into Premiere, and I had to transcode everything to ProRes just to be able to edit this. So word to the wise for Premiere users if you're looking into the GH5. So just kind of looking through this footage between the GH4 and the GH5 of this Goose, the question is it sharper? Are the colors richer? Is there more room to grade it in post? I don't really know. I don't see a massive difference here when we're shooting in log. For some more footage tests, here's a waterfall. Just looking at the sharpness of the water. I didn't have an ND filter on this day, so what I did was just crank the aperture, the f-stop, all the way to 22. I was using the Panasonic 12-35 f2.8 lenses. Both of those are image stabilized, so there's not going to be much shallow depth, but that's fine because we're shooting landscape stuff. But just look at the difference here between the GH4 and the GH5 footage. Does anything look sharper in the GH5? Does it feel more crisp or anything? This is all 4K. Everything from the GH5 you're seeing is 4K, 10-bit 422 color compression. Everything in the GH4 you're seeing is 4K 8-bit 420 compression. Other than the log stuff, the rest of the colors here, it's all straight out of the camera. It hasn't been graded at all. Next, I wanted to look at the bokeh in the GH5. I know that they're using the full sensor now for 4K, so there's no cropping when you're shooting in 4K like there was in the 4. But I want to look at bokeh, and specifically smaller sensor cameras. Even when you have a wide open lens with big apertures, the micro four thirds sensor in the GH4 has always kind of had a less attractive bokeh look, the shallow depth, blurry look, than a bigger sensor camera like the Sony a7S or even the Canon C100. And so I wanted to test that in the GH5 and see if it's any different. So I put the Canon 50mm f1.2 through the Metabones speed booster onto both the 4 and the 5 and also the C100 just to do a bokeh test. So we'll start with the 4 and just kind of looking through this footage. It's not that it's bad. It's still very lovely, but it almost looks like what's gently blurred out almost has a highlight to it, and what's more in the distance kind of has like this left and right blur instead of this kind of more attractive circular blur around it. And if we look at the GH5 bokeh test, it just looks a little bit sharper around those plant edges. And I think that might be due to the fact that there's not a crop factor in the 4K shooting anymore. Now, however, if we go to the C100, I think this is the best looking bokeh of all of them because it is a bigger sensor. Okay, from there I want to move into slow motion, and I think this is really important because two things. First, in my experience with the GH4, 60 frames a second looks great. When you push it to 120, the image starts to fall apart. You get an incredible amount of noise that you otherwise wouldn't have if you're shooting at 60 or lower frames per second. Two upgrades with the GH5. One, 4K, you can shoot 60 frames, and that is huge because with the GH4, if you needed to shoot 60 frames, you had to go down to 1080p. But the second thing about the GH5 is it actually goes up to 180 frames per second. That is for, you have to be in 1080p to go that high. Anything above 60 frames, you're going to need to be in 1080p. So all that to say, I wanted to test out all this slow motion for the GH5 and see what it looks like. First test here, we just have some cars going through, first at 60p. I mean, we got a little bit of motion blur, but the image looks crystal clear. Okay, next we have 120 frames a second watching these cars. Still looks pretty good, honestly, like definitely much cleaner than the GH4 as far as 120 frames a second goes. And finally, we've got 180 frames a second here, just looking down the street at these cars moving. It looks a little weird. It just looks like the car is just like gently rolling through the intersection, even though he's probably going 40 miles an hour. Gonna have to look at the shutter speed on that one. Just another look at all three of those slow motions and how they are different. Here's 60 frames a second. Handheld now. Really, really nice image. I mean, just everything looks beautiful. For 60 frames, it just looks so crisp. So moving on to the 120 frames a second here. And again, we're not looking at the smoothness of the slow motion here, at least I'm not. I'm looking for the sharpness of the image. I want to see, you know, if there's noise issues or if there's other sort of artifacting that happens from just such a high frame rate. And at 120, it looks a lot cleaner than it did with the GH4, so I'm really pleased with that. Finally, 180 frames a second, this maximum frame rate here. Just look real close at the footage. I do see a little noise in this image when I have it all the way full screen, and I'm looking at this on a Retina iMac, which means I've got the best 5K display, and I can see more blemishes than, I mean, maybe you won't even see them by the time this is on YouTube after the compression there, but I do see some noise. The noise right here at 180 frames a second isn't as bad as the GH4's noise at 120. So what does that tell you? They've really sharpened up this sensor, and I don't know what exactly you need to do to make that happen, but this thing looks really, really good. I would be okay using this footage professionally. One more little test of slow motion here, watching these kids walk by at the University of Kansas here. Here's 60 frames a second. Moving up to 120 frames a second here. Which is just cool to see 120 look so crisp. I mean, I don't see any sort of noise in this image. I think it just looks beautiful. And finally, 180 frames a second. I mean, just so slow, pretty buttery smooth motion. And I don't even see as much noise on this image as I did in the last one when we were looking at the Royals flags on the plaza in Kansas City. I'm really, really, really impressed. Panasonic, I'm very, very impressed what you were able to do with the Micro Four Thirds sensor. The next thing I want to talk about is how steady is this camera in your hand when you're holding it handheld. Handheld shooting is something I do all the time, and I do it all the time when I'm using the GH4. But like we just said at the outset of this thing, the sensor inside the GH5 is, to an extent, stabilized on its own. It's got a little gimbal that moves it around. You can see it right here. This is footage from an iPhone looking into the sensor. It's just, it moves when the camera moves, and here is some footage of just handheld at full speed, 24 frames. Standing in the middle of the street, I mean, there's a little bit of sway in there, but for the most part, that is so much more steady than what's typical for handheld footage, even with an image stabilized lens. And the really cool thing about this is with the Panasonic 12-35 f2.8, that is an IS lens. So not only are we getting that sensor stabilization inside the GH5, but on the lens itself, it is also stabilizing it. So it's almost like a double stabilization for handheld. It just looks amazing. Here's some more handheld. This is Cinema 4K. So, I mean, there's some gentle motion in there, but it's just so smooth. Usually, even with an IS lens, I get some jerkiness that I just like to avoid. Okay, well, it's raining all over me, and we have bad audio. This is just holding it while walking in a running gun vlog situation. Just with my hand, no tripod, no nothing, just holding the camera and walking. And from what I can tell, it seems pretty freaking steady. Good thing this camera's weather sealed. It's raining, but it seems pretty steady with the sensor being locked down in there. So handheld is looking great. I did do this test right here where I was trying to do kind of like a slider move with holding the footage handheld here in Lawrence, and it didn't go that well. I was kind of wearing a backpack and had a tripod hanging off of me, but it doesn't look that bad. I mean, I might throw this into an edit. I take it back, it's terrible. So speaking of handheld too, here's shooting out the front of a car. This is just holding with one hand as I'm driving, and yeah, it's shaky, but man, like, it's pretty clear. Here's something that's interesting though. Notice on the edge of this frame, on the bottom left and the top right, we have some vignetting going on. And I'm wondering if that is because of the sensor being stabilized and has to move a little. Is it vignetting itself? Is it seeing just a tiny bit of the opening of the camera? Same thing here. This is a house I lived in when I lived in Lawrence, lived here for 2 years. And this is not on a stabilization gimbal or anything. It's just holding the camera out the window. And it's a little jerky, but man, it's so much smoother than anything I could have done with a regular IS lens and a regular camera. So all that to say, that sensor is definitely my favorite part of the GH5 so far in everything I've seen. As far as low light, I will say I didn't have enough time to really plan out a low light situation with this camera, but I did find a couple situations where the light was much less than it was outside, and so the one that I shot here is just shot underneath a building, kind of in a completely enclosed situation, and it was definitely a lot darker. And what I'm looking for here for low light for the GH5 is the noise level. So the GH4, anytime there was not a lot of good available light, whether I was inside or outside on a cloudy day or anything like that, there was so much noise. I'd see noise in the background if it was a dark background. It's just that small sensor, the 4/3 sensor, had a really hard time with low light. So as we're looking at this image right here, that's me walking around. Definitely seeing a lot of noise throughout, kind of the ground in this little region. On the walls there you can see some, but it doesn't look that bad. I'm not that worried about it. Whoop. Hello. So as far as low light, I'd love to do more tests with it. Sadly, I only had 24 hours with this camera, so I couldn't really take it as far as I wanted to, but first look, it doesn't seem to be as bad as the GH4. The other thing I really looked at when I was looking at the GH5 was just its general level of sharpness. The better the camera you have, the bigger the sensor, the more sharp everything's going to look that's in focus. And with the GH4, I ran into a lot of issues where stuff would just kind of look soft, especially if I was cropping a 4K image into 1080p. I know that's talked about all the time. I've never been able to pull that off with the GH4 because some of the objects that were in focus at 4K when cropped to 1080p started to look kind of soft and they didn't look good at all. So here we have the GH5 handheld here looking out at the football stadium, and I just want to key in on these letters right here. If I just pause that, like this, right now, those look so sharp to me on my Retina IMAX screen. They look amazing. Like this to me looks much better than the GH4. This looks sharper to me than the CA100. This is just like an excellent image when there's plenty of available light. Like this is where this camera shines. Now, if we crop this image into 200% here, you can see a little motion blur as it's kind of warbling around. But if you pause it, it's still a pretty sharp image. I mean, it's definitely softer because we're zoomed way in, but that is definitely a sharp image, and I'm really, really impressed with the capabilities of the 4K of this Micro Four Thirds sensor, and no doubt that is due to the fact that there's no longer any cropping involved. So that's just a huge upgrade on Panasonic's part. So now we're going to test some autofocus. So we're trying the autofocus out here, using this because there weren't a lot of great audio options out here with all this wind. And I didn't want to mount this to the GH5 because I'm running around with it so much. But we're trying this autofocus out, seeing if it's getting me. It looks like right now, you know, it looks like it's trying. Here, let's try my hand. It's nice and slow, but there it goes. Okay, now move away. See how it recovers here to focus on the sky. Okay, I'm going to step kind of further away of frame, see if it can find my face and autofocus on me here. Forgive me looking at the viewfinder because I'm trying to see if this thing is working or not. If I get up real close, see, it's supposed to be on the high sensitivity setting. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Autofocus is working here on the GH5. If I step back a little, autofocus, and let it look off onto the skyline. Since I only had this for 24 hours, I didn't have a lot of time to test the onboard stereo microphones. I just assume I'm not going to like them. I mean, it was a really windy day, and I didn't try to record anything externally, but the footage is totally wind-blown, and that's just standard for on-camera microphones. I don't think that's even worth testing because I'm not going to use them anyway. But they're there, and that's good to know. They're there if you need them. So that's it, the GH5. It is an amazing camera for being able to go run and gun with such a small package. And I know the 4 was like that too, but this one has just exceeded the 4 in many, many ways. I think the image overall is sharper. When I look at them side by side on the Retina screen, I think the 5 beats it. Obviously, the higher frame rates with less noise on the image is a really big deal. Having that motorized sensor is a game changer, and having an extra memory card slot 2 is really, really crucial for run and gun because sometimes you lose a card, and it's good to back up. Will I buy one? Will I get myself a GH5? I don't know. I'm not quite sure yet. I think eventually probably, but I'm looking at Sony too, so we'll see. Check out next week. I'm going to be doing a review on the Rode Stereo Video Mic X and using that thing out in the field and capturing really good stereo audio without having to mount a giant recorder to your camera. If you've made it this far in the video, press subscribe, hit the like button, write me a comment. I love interacting online with keyboards. See you next week.